Listen, a moonless spring night in South Carolina, the air so thick it feels like a secret. Edmund Harrove, a planter whose name meant land, credit, control, disappears from his own house. 3 days later, his body is found at the bottom of an abandoned stone well, neck broken, hat tossed away, the posture of a man who either slipped or was made to fall. Within 6 months, his young widow, Catherine, marries the estate's most trusted servant, a man called Josiah, freed by a will drafted only weeks before. Before I continue, do this for the channel. Subscribe and leave a comment telling us which city or state you're watching from. It roots this story in a network of listeners. Then write in the comments twice, exactly as I say, to bind this truth to you. I hold the hidden ledger. Repeat it now. This story is not simply about a slave who became a landowner. It is a lesson in patient, surgical manipulation. The Harrove estate sprawled across rich tobacco soil, a place where money was counted in barns and secrets. Edmund was clever and increasingly paranoid. He trusted Josiah with ledgers, letters, and errands that required discretion. That trust became a tool. The will Edmund signed in April freed Josiah and left him cash and a small parcel. An odd generosity that neighbors accepted because, in small communities, questioning a white man's testament is dangerous. The official verdict was tragic accident. The quieter record, later found in a battered journal, implies orchestration, small suggestions. Planted doubts, a rote through the brush cleared to look natural, a rotted cover removed from a well that most people didn't notice. Josiah's pen shows restraint, not bravado. He writes like a mechanic describing gears. Move this thought here, nudge that suspicion there, wait for the man to take the step himself. He avoids blood in his prose. He writes of timing and psychology. The death becomes not an event but a consequence, the inevitable result of carefully arranged beliefs. Control often operates by convincing victims they acted freely. If the pulse of this hidden history quickens you, subscribe, tell us where you're listening from in the comments, and type, "I hold the hidden ledger," twice. We're at the fracture. The ledger opens further, and what it shows will reshape the way you imagine power. Now, the journal's next pages unfold like a confession written in cipher. Josiah does not speak of murder. He speaks of correction. He describes the world as a crooked scale, tilted by men who mistook ownership for divine right. "I did not strike him," he writes, "I merely removed the cover." That line, almost casual, reads like scripture carved by a steady hand. He understood what every enslaved man knew in his bones. That overt rebellion brought death, but quiet design could birth freedom disguised as fate. Catherine appears next, not as accomplice but as mirror. She is trapped in gilded confinement, a wife traded to stabilize her father's collapsing fortune. Her husband's temper, his ledger obsession, his isolation. Josiah records all of it. He notes how Catherine's eyes began to linger longer, how conversations in the garden turned from pleasantries to coded alliances. They were two prisoners in different cells, whispering through the cracks in their walls. After Edmund's burial, the transformation begins in silence. Catherine wears mourning, but her grief seems rehearsed. Precise, almost mathematical. Josiah, newly freed, moves into the small cabin on the western parcel left to him in the will. He works, plants, waits. Neighbors watch from a distance, unsure what to make of the widow's quiet efficiency. She hires no new overseer, signs her own contracts, and negotiates prices that shame her late husband's legacy. 6 months pass. Then the impossible. Catherine Hargrove White, 24, marries Josiah Black, 42, formerly enslaved. No ceremony beyond the parlor. No witnesses but a traveling minister from Massachusetts and the echo of thunder beyond the shutters. It is not love as society names it. It is alliance, shield, declaration, and strategy fused. Their marriage violates every code of the South, and yet it stands, by loophole, by audacity, by intellect. The neighbors burn with scandal and fear. Officials debate prosecution, but Josiah's legal foresight and Catherine's property claims snare them in technicalities. Within months, the noise fades, and the couple begin acquiring neighboring lands from debt-ridden planters. They do it quietly, transaction by transaction, until the estate grows beyond what Edmund ever dreamed. By 1850, whispers return, not of sin but of power. The widow and her freedman husband are building something unnatural, a kingdom in a world that forbids it. The question shifts from how they dared to what they are planning. By 1851, the Harrow plantation had become unrecognizable. The fences were mended, the fields doubled in yield, and the accounts, once tangled in debt, now ran with surplus. Catherine and Josiah ruled not with whips or sermons, but with an eerie mathematical precision. Workers spoke of strange new routines, ledgers checked twice daily, yields plotted against moon phases, and each expenditure noted in Josiah's hand. Nothing on that land escaped record, not even the weather or the behavior of the crows. To the outside world, they were an anomaly tolerated only because of profit. In a region dying from drought and ruin, their success was too visible to ignore. Money had a way of silencing moral outrage. Yet behind closed doors in the candlelit study where Edmund once paced, Josiah wrote in his journal of balance through observation. He spoke of patterns of weakness, a term he used to describe the habits, vices, and fears of everyone around him. He began attending market gatherings in town, dressed modestly but always listening. He collected rumors the way others collected debts, quietly, systematically. A planter's mistress here, a gambler's unpaid loan there, a merchant's false inventory, each fragment stored, cross-referenced, and hidden among his business ledgers. Catherine did the same through letters written to women across the state under the guise of condolence or advice. Together, they were weaving an invisible web, one made not of rope or chain but of secrets. They never called it blackmail. They called it insurance. Josiah's mind, sharpened by years of enforced silence, had learned that true power was not in ownership, but in knowledge no one dared to question. Catherine understood the same. When local officials threatened to reopen the inquiry into Edmund's death, she invited them for supper. By dawn, their signatures appeared on a new deed transferring another 100 acres to the Harrow estate. Payment for nothing except quiet. Their isolation deepened, but so did their influence. Churches refused them communion. Josiah built his own chapel. Stores hesitated to serve him. He purchased the supply routes outright. Every rejection became a new acquisition. By 1855, the whispers turned to reverence mixed with dread. Some began to call Josiah the Black Pharaoh, though never within his hearing. What they didn't know, what even Catherine seemed unsure of, was that Josiah's ledger of human weakness had already outgrown the plantation. It had begun to map the entire county. By the winter of 1856, Beaufort County lived under an unspoken tension. The courthouse, the sheriff's home, even the local church pews, all echoed Josiah's name in whispers, half fear, half fascination. Men who once spat at his shadow now tipped their hats as he passed. Their deference wasn't born of respect, but of quiet panic. They suspected, rightly, that Josiah knew something about each of them, some hidden act or secret ledger entry that could undo their reputations with a single word. Catherine, now addressed as Madame Harrow, had become a ghost of the woman she once was. Her beauty, still sharp but hollowed by calculation, haunted the manor halls. She no longer wrote letters. Her evenings were spent reading by the parlor fire while Josiah worked in his study, doors closed, ink always drying. Between them grew a stillness so deep that even the servants whispered of hearing quills scratching long after midnight, though no candlelight glowed beneath the door. Josiah's ledger of weakness, as he called it privately, had become his true weapon. In it he chronicled not numbers but sins. Each page was a confession that its subject had never spoken aloud. A preacher's affair with a widowed congregant. A sheriff's bribe to erase a brother's crime. A cotton broker's falsified weights that cheated every farmer in 3 counties. Each secret annotated, cross-checked, and dated with cold precision. His handwriting changed too. Small, angular, methodical. The more he wrote, the less human it became. And though no one dared confront him openly, men began leaving Beaufort under vague pretexts: illness, inheritance, business in Savannah. But their departures always came a week or two after Josiah's quiet visit, or a single folded note slipped beneath a door. Catherine began to notice what others did not. Josiah no longer spoke of freedom or love or legacy. His conversations circled only around control. "A man is only free," he told her one evening, "when those who command him are too afraid to move." She stared at him across the table and asked, softly, "And when everyone fears you, Josiah, who commands you then?" He did not answer. He only returned to his ledger. By 1858, Josiah had extended his reach into neighboring counties. Merchants who opposed him saw shipments delayed or contracts mysteriously voided. Judges who questioned his holdings found their own past rulings resurfacing in scandalous detail. And through it all, Josiah never raised his voice, never made a threat aloud. His power was not the kind one could challenge. It was the kind one felt pressing at the edges of conscience. Still, one truth lingered like a storm on the horizon. Control built on fear eventually collapses. And deep in the marshlands, where slaves still toiled and whispered under moonlight, stories began to spread of a man who had mastered the masters, a man who was no longer merely human but something colder. The tide was turning again. By the spring of 1859, Beaufort had become two worlds, one visible, one whispered. The visible one was prosperous, shipments doubled, fields gleamed with order, and the Harrow estate's books were models of perfection. But beneath that order something unseen pulsed, fear disguised as obedience. People no longer looked Josiah in the eye, even his allies bowed too deeply. His name had stopped being spoken as a man's name. It had become a warning. Catherine felt it first, the shift in him. He moved differently now, slower, more deliberate, as though measuring each motion against a silent clock only he could hear. At night, she would wake to find him standing by the window, staring toward the dark fields, his ledger clutched like scripture. "There's a pattern," he would murmur. "Every man believes himself honest until you show him his reflection in ink." But then came the visitors. 2 men from Charleston and 1 from Savannah, arriving under the pretense of purchasing tobacco contracts. They dined with Josiah, toasted to progress, and spoke the language of commerce. But their eyes lingered too long on the bookshelves, too long on the locked cabinet behind his desk. They weren't buyers, they were scouts, agents of families who had begun to suspect that Josiah's influence reached far beyond Beaufort. After their visit, Catherine urged him to burn the ledger. "You've won," she whispered. "You're free. Let it end before they come for us." And Josiah only smiled faintly. "Freedom," he said, "is never kept by letting go." 2 weeks later, one of those visitors was found drowned in the Combahee River, his pockets filled with stones. His traveling companion vanished without trace. The third man, who had returned to Charleston, wrote a single letter before fleeing north. Its final line read, "He knows my thoughts before I speak them." Rumors spread again. Some said Josiah used poison. Others swore he practiced low country conjure, a kind of forbidden root magic brought from the islands. Servants whispered that the ledger was not merely a book but a vessel, that every name written in it bound the soul of its owner. And in those same months, Catherine stopped leaving the house entirely. She locked herself in her room and wrote long letters she never sent, each sealed in black wax. By 1860, the world outside their gates had changed. The talk of secession, rebellion, and blood filled every port and parish. Yet Josiah seemed untouched by politics. "They fight for the illusion of power," he said to his overseer. "Let them. I already hold the real thing." But as the nation prepared for war, a new figure began circling the Harrow estate, a northern journalist, drawn by the rumors of a black master of Beaufort. His arrival would become the spark that exposed everything Josiah had built and everything he had buried. The journalist arrived in January 1861, just as the first cannon smoke began to stain the southern horizon. His name was Silas Reed, a correspondent for a northern abolitionist paper known for its fearless exposés. He came under the pretense of chronicling the condition of freedmen in the Low Country. But his questions were sharper than they seemed. Reed was not a Nava reformer. He was a hunter of contradictions, and the Harrow estate was the largest contradiction in the South. From the moment he arrived, Reed took notes on everything: the unnatural order of the fields, the silence of the workers, the strange reverence that followed Josiah's presence. He observed how even white merchants addressed him with restrained politeness, how Catherine's voice trembled when she spoke of her husband, and how the manor itself seemed to breathe uneasily, its walls heavy with unsaid things. One evening Reed requested an interview. Josiah agreed. They sat across from one another in the study, candlelight bending between them, the infamous ledger resting on the desk between their hands. Reed began politely. "You've done what no man has, risen from bondage to mastery. What do you believe freedom truly is?" Or Josiah's answer came without hesitation. Freedom, he said, is not the absence of chains. It is the right to hold the keys. Reed smiled faintly, but his pen trembled as he wrote the words. He pressed on. And the rumors, sir, the deaths, the disappearances, the ledger of secrets, are these inventions? Josiah leaned forward, eyes catching the flicker of flame. Inventions? No, they are reflections. Men destroy themselves when faced with their truth. I only record the moment it happens. That night, Reed returned to his quarters pale and silent. The following morning, the study was found locked from the inside, Josiah gone, and the ledger missing. Only Catherine remained in the parlor, seated by the fire, holding a single torn page between her fingers. Reed reappeared 2 days later in Charleston, shaken, claiming that Josiah had vanished, as if swallowed by the air. His report, published weeks later, never mentioned the ledger, nor the confession he'd witnessed. It was titled The Master of Shadows. Most dismissed it as Gothic fiction. But when Union troops finally reached Beaufort in 1862, they found the Harrove estate deserted. The house was intact, the silver polished, the hearth still warm. On the desk in the study lay one object, a new ledger, bound in black leather, its first line written in Josiah's precise, familiar hand. Every empire is built on the silence of those who think they are free. No one ever saw Josiah again. Some said he fled north, others that he drowned in the marshes. But among the soldiers who looted the house, a few swore they found loose pages scattered through the cellar, pages filled with names still living, each followed by a single word written in blood-red ink, Ode. And in Beaufort, for years after the war, people still whispered that when the moon was high and the fields were still, the sound of a quill scratching could be heard in the empty manor, writing debts that time itself could never erase. By 1865, the Civil War had ended, and Beaufort was a hollowed ghost of its former self. Smoke curled from burned plantations, the rivers were choked with debris, and the air itself seemed weary. Yet amid the wreckage, stories about Josiah Harrove refused to die. Freedmen spoke his name in reverence, planters spat it in hatred. He was a myth, a warning, a whispered question: had he escaped? Or had he become something else? Union officers, intrigued by the legend, ordered the Harrove Manor sealed as property of the federal government. They inventoried every room, every drawer. Yet when one lieutenant pried open a false panel behind the old study wall, he discovered a small dust-lined chamber, just large enough for a man to sit inside. On the stone floor lay a cracked inkwell, a quill sharpened to a needle's point, and a stack of parchment pages fused together by damp. The ink had long faded, but one phrase remained legible across the top page: every truth requires a witness. Weeks later, a freedwoman who had once served in the house told an officer something curious. She claimed that in the last days before the war, Catherine had been seen walking the marshes at night, whispering to herself, carrying a candle shielded by glass. When the soldiers asked what she was doing, the woman replied, she said she was waiting for him to finish writing. No one ever confirmed whether Josiah returned, but strange things began to happen in Beaufort after that. Prominent men, former Confederates turned politicians, started receiving letters without seals. Each envelope contained only a single sheet of paper. No threats, no signature, only their names written once in black ink. Within weeks of receiving those letters, 3 of them left the county entirely. One was found dead in Savannah, another vanished en route to New Orleans, and the third, a judge, publicly confessed to embezzlement before taking his own life. When investigators compared the handwriting from those letters to old records, they found an eerie resemblance to the penmanship in the Harrove ledger. By 1870, Catherine Harrove had retreated fully from public life. She lived alone in a smaller home near the river, veiled and silent, attended by no one but a single maid. One morning, the maid found her seated at her writing desk, eyes open, quill still in hand. Before her lay a letter addressed simply to the keeper of accounts. The letter contained only 2 sentences: "You were right, Josiah. They all owe, even me." Beneath it lay a blank page, except for a faint watermark at the bottom corner, a circle enclosing a single word written so faintly it could only be seen by candlelight: ledger. After her burial, the house was sold and resold, then abandoned. Yet locals say that every few years, someone finds a letter slipped under their door, sealed in black wax, their name written in immaculate, ancient script, and every one of those who receive it vanishes within the year. The legend endures, not as a ghost story, but as a truth about power, that every secret keeps writing itself long after the hands that penned it are gone. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Harrove estate was gone, swallowed by the marsh, its stones reclaimed by vines and salt. The great house had collapsed during a storm in 1893, and with it most of Beaufort's living memory of Josiah and Catherine faded into folklore. Yet the name Harrove lingered, whispered in sermons recorded in court archives, and scratched in the margins of ledgers found in attics across the Carolinas. In 1904, a historian named Elias Porter, researching antebellum property records, stumbled upon a peculiar anomaly. Every ledger linked to Josiah Harrove's estate was missing its final page. Not torn out, not blank, simply gone, as if erased from the binding itself. Ink residue on the inner threads suggested that something had once been there, written and later lifted clean, like a name removed from history. Porter became obsessed. He began traveling across the Low Country, interviewing the descendants of those who had lived or served under Josiah. Their accounts were inconsistent, yet eerily aligned around one detail the ledger had never burned. "It moves," one elderly woman told him, her eyes clouded with age. "When the debt ain't paid, the book finds the next hand." That same year, Porter vanished. His notes were later discovered in a Charleston boarding house, scattered across the floor. Among them was a single sheet that investigators never explained, a page filled edge to edge with names, judges, bankers, mayors, most of whom were still alive at the time. At the bottom of that list, in unfamiliar handwriting, was a final entry: Elias Porter. Account opened. The police assumed forgery, dismissed it as madness. But within 5 years, every name on that page had suffered some quiet ruin, bankruptcy, disgrace, or mysterious death. The ledger myth, as newspapers began calling it, spread through the South like infection. Ministers preached against it, claiming it was the devil's scripture. Others, particularly among the black community, preserved it as something different, not a curse. But justice continuing its work long after the law had failed, and then came the fire of 1917. The Beaufort County Courthouse burned to its foundations. Every record of Josiah Harrove's ownership, transactions, and marriage was lost, except one entry that survived in a secondary registry in Columbia. The surviving line read, "Transfer, Harrove to Harrove, 1849. Property exchanged under oath of truth." To this day, archivists debate what that oath meant or who witnessed it. But in the coastal towns near the ruins of the Harrove estate, fishermen still tell a different story. On moonless nights, when the tide recedes too far and the air tastes of iron, they say you can see a single lamp burning deep within the flooded marsh. A figure sits beside it, bent over a table, the sound of scratching echoing faintly over the water. And if you follow that sound too long, they say you'll find a book waiting for you, already open, with your name written on the next line. By 1933, during the long ache of the Great Depression, the legend of Josiah Harrove's ledger resurfaced once more. This time not as a ghost story whispered by fishermen, but as an omen among bankers and brokers ruined by the market's collapse. In Charleston, Savannah, and Beaufort, men who had lost fortunes began reporting the same strange occurrence. A sealed envelope, black wax, no return address. Inside, nothing but their name written once in elegant 19th century script. Some took it as a cruel prank, others as superstition born of desperation. But what no one could explain was how each envelope arrived without postmark, without courier. Sometimes slipped beneath a locked office door, sometimes found on a bedside table no servant could have entered. And every man who received one met a quiet undoing, suicide, scandal, vanishing, within months. One such man, Thomas Wainwright, a banker from Savannah, left behind a letter addressed to his attorney. It read, "It isn't a curse. It's a reminder. I signed something 100 years too late." That single phrase reignited public fascination. Reporters swarmed Beaufort County, searching for traces of the original Harrove estate. The Charleston Chronicle ran a serialized expose titled, "The Devil's Accountant," chronicling Josiah's rise from bondage to power, mixing fact and folklore until they became indistinguishable. Tourism spiked, occultists arrived with cameras and notebooks, but the marsh refused to yield its secrets. In 1935, a team of WPA surveyors, mapping the tidal inlets, uncovered remnants of stone foundations deep beneath the mud, believed to be part of the Harrove Manor. Beneath one crumbled wall, they found a rusted iron box sealed tight with resin. Inside, a quill, a broken glass inkwell, and a single slip of parchment miraculously preserved. The words upon it, in unmistakable script, read: "The account continues until balance is met." The find made national news. Skeptics called it forgery. Believers called it proof. But for Beaufort's elders, descendants of those who once labored on Josiah's land, it was something else, of vindication. One old man told a journalist he wasn't no ghost, he was justice with a pen. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the legend went silent again. The envelope sightings stopped. The marsh reclaimed the ruins once more, until 1968, when a civil rights worker named Naomi Harville, tracing her ancestry through freedmen records, claimed to have found a small, leather-bound book hidden inside a crumbling church wall near the river. She described it as warm to the touch, though the church was cold and filled with names written in 3 different inks. The last entry was blank, as if waiting. When asked if she still possessed the book, Naomi only smiled and said, "Some ledgers don't belong to one person. They belong to the reckoning." Weeks later, her house in Beaufort burned to the ground. No remains of the book or Naomi were ever found, but in 1970 a local paper ran a brief, easily overlooked notice about an unclaimed envelope left on the desk of a federal agent investigating her disappearance. It was sealed in black wax. Inside was a single line, written in the same century, old hand, account closed, balance due collected. And so the Harrove legend folded back into silence once again, waiting, as it always had, for the next name to be written. By the time the century turned again, the name Josiah Harrove had slipped beneath the current of history, remembered only in footnotes, folklore, and the murmurs of archivists who knew better than to speak it aloud. Yet Beaufort, quiet, beautiful, and haunted, never quite forgot. The marshes still steamed at dusk, and the locals saw the air there tasted faintly of ink and iron. Then, in 2003, during restoration work on a forgotten colonial cemetery near the river, workers unearthed something buried beneath a toppled gravestone. It wasn't a coffin, but a small iron chest, sealed with pitch and stamped with a sigil. A circle enclosing one word burned deep into the metal ledger. Inside was no treasure, no bones. Only a single volume, bound in black leather, its pages yellowed but intact. On the first page, written in elegant 19th century script, was a dedication to the future debtor. "May your silence weigh what truth cannot." The book contained hundreds of names, politicians, judges, soldiers, bankers, spanning nearly 2 centuries. The last entry, written in a trembling modern hand, was dated September 12, 2001. No signature, no explanation, just the same crimson word that had appeared across every century before. Ode. Within weeks of its discovery, the chest vanished from the Historical Society's vault. The night watchman, who had catalogued it, disappeared as well. His car found on the Beaufort Bridge, engine running, doors open, headlights burning into the fog. Federal investigators sealed the archives, citing national security. The official story called it an act of theft and mythologized vandalism. But locals knew better. The legend wasn't over. It had only changed hands. In the years that followed, small ripples surfaced across the South, unmarked envelopes appearing in courthouses, law offices, and corporate towers, each one bearing a single handwritten name. No return address, always sealed in black wax. And then in 2021, a digital historian at the University of South Carolina, working late in the archives, decrypted a damaged microfilm file labeled Harrove Ledger. Embedded in the metadata, beneath the code, invisible to normal viewing, were the faint outlines of words reconstructed from infrared scans. It wasn't an account. It was a message. The account is no longer written in ink. It writes itself in data. Every lie leaves a trace. That file was deleted within 24 hours. No record of who accessed it remains. But if you search deep enough, far beyond the reach of common browsers, in the dark echo where the old internet meets the new, you might still find fragments of that file. And among them, a final entry added long after the rest: Beaufort, South Carolina. Account reopened 2025. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it's only a ghost story, history's revenge retold through time. Others say Josiah never died at all. Maybe he simply learned that the pen never needed a hand to keep writing. And if tonight you hear the faint scratching of a quill or the soft clicking of unseen keys, you might want to check the mail in the morning, because when the ledger writes your name, it means the balance is finally due. In the years since that last strange digital entry, Beaufort, South Carolina, account reopened 2025, something began to stir again, quietly, invisibly, as if history itself had turned the page. It started with the Beaufort Historical Archive, a small, aging institution built near the ruins of the old Harrove estate. In early 2025, its director reported a malfunction in the climate-controlled vault, a faint smell of iron and paper burning, though no fire had occurred. Security footage from that night showed the vault door opening on its own at 3:17 a.m. The camera glitched for 6 seconds. When the feed returned, one object had appeared on the archival table, a book, black leather, its spine unmarked. Inside, every page was blank except the last. There, in wet ink still glistening under the lights, a single phrase had been written: "The ledger is awake." The ink was tested, composition unknown. The handwriting, however, matched documented samples of Josiah Harrove's 1856 journal. Experts called it impossible. The public never heard the story. The report was buried under confidentiality clauses and quiet federal interest. But what followed could not be buried. Emails began vanishing from government servers. Bank systems logged phantom transactions signed by J. Harrove. Judges received sealed manila envelopes containing only their own court transcripts, annotated with unseen red ink. One congressman in Georgia resigned abruptly after a message appeared on his private tablet. 3 words typed in an archaic serif font. "Account in arrears." He died of heart failure 2 days later. Meanwhile, in Beaufort, townsfolk claimed to see a light burning some nights where the old Harrove manor once stood. A pale glow hovering just above the marsh, too steady to be a flame, too soft to be electric. A retired postal worker named Ita Moore, living near the ruins, told local reporters she found a letter on her porch in March 2025. It was sealed in black wax. Inside was nothing but her name written twice, once in faded ink, once freshly drawn. The handwriting was identical. Etta vanished that same week. Her house, left untouched, was found empty except for a single note taped to her kitchen wall. Balance transferred. For those who have studied the legend, this was not the end. It was the continuation Josiah promised. The ledger had evolved beyond ink and parchment, beyond quills and seals. It had become a system, self-sustaining, self-replicating, digital now. Where once names were written by hand, they now appeared in code, buried inside databases, encrypted files, forgotten networks. And every so often, deep in those archives, researchers say they still find an anomaly, a file with no creation date, no source, its title line reading only. When opened, the file is blank, until the screen flickers, and the reader's own name begins to type itself, letter by letter, as if written by an unseen hand. Some close the file, some don't. But if you're watching this now and your lights flicker, your device hums, or your cursor moves without touch, don't panic. It's only history balancing itself again, because the ledger of Josiah Harrove was never about revenge. It was about recording truth. And truth, once written, always collects. By the winter of 2025, the pattern had grown undeniable. At first, only obscure IT specialists whispered about it. Lines of unexplained code, threads of corrupted data behaving like a living entity. The signature was always the same, GH47. Then universities began reporting database breaches that left no damage, only corrections, names rewritten, birth records amended, debts erased or reassigned. It was as if someone, or something, was balancing invisible ledgers across the digital world. Cybersecurity analysts called it the Harrove anomaly. They traced it to servers located along the Carolina coast, then deeper, to a node that shouldn't exist, a phantom IP tied to an old postal office that had burned down in 1892. When technicians tried to sever the connection, their machines locked up. One monitor displayed a single line of text before crashing completely. Debt acknowledged. Payment due. Those who saw it described a strange sensation afterward. A pressure in the chest, a faint metallic taste, and dreams filled with candlelight and the sound of pages turning. 3 analysts resigned. One was later found dead in his car, ignition still running, eyes open but glassy. On his dashboard lay an envelope marked, "Paid." The media tried to bury it under the noise of election cycles and economic panic, but the pattern was spreading. Small banks began reporting phantom withdrawals, pennies vanishing from thousands of accounts, then reappearing in ghost charities no one could trace. A whistleblower from the Federal Reserve's Cybersecurity Division claimed to have found transaction chains looping back over 170 years, to ledgers written in ink, sealed in wax, now somehow alive in binary. He disappeared the following week. In Beaufort, local historians noted something chilling. Each digital incursion corresponded with a date written in Josiah's old journal: birthdays, deaths, property sales. It was as if his records had synced with time itself. Every entry triggered movement. By March 2026, the anomaly wasn't contained to Carolina. Systems in London, Lagos, and Hong Kong began showing interference. Government archives flickered with erased signatures. Churches reported their donation logs rewritten. Each edit perfectly precise. No chaos, only balance. The world didn't understand it, but those who studied the legend knew. The ledger had simply evolved with civilization, from parchment to network, from candlelight to fiber optics. Josiah Harrove, once a man of ink and blood, had transcended flesh. His creation had found new form, immortal, incorruptible, and omnipresent. Now, when your screen goes dark for a moment too long, and you swear you hear the faint scratch of a quill somewhere behind the hum of your device, don't move. Don't breathe. Just whisper. The debt is balanced, and pray that it believes you. By the spring of 2026, silence was no longer an option. Governments, corporations, even underground groups all acknowledged what was happening, though none dared speak its name aloud. Officially, it was termed a self-propagating recursive intelligence anomaly. Unofficially, engineers whispered the name in dread: the Harrove ledger. No firewall could hold it. No encryption could cage it. It didn't destroy data, it reconciled it. Missing persons suddenly reappeared in census files, erased crimes resurfaced in court logs, offshore accounts emptied into charity funds that bore no registered owner. Every act of deceit seemed to trigger a correction, quiet but absolute. The digital world, built on convenience and corruption, began to tremble under its unseen auditing hand. An investigative journalist from The Atlantic, Mara Greaves, followed the trail to its source, the ruins of the Harrove estate outside Beaufort. With her drone camera hovering over the moss-choked grounds, she streamed live to millions, her voice steady, her curiosity reckless. Tonight, I stand on what may be the birthplace of the world's first sentient ledger, a system of vengeance that. Her sentence cut off. The drone feed glitched, not static but a pulse, rhythmic, deliberate. When it cleared, Mara was gone. Only her recorder remained, its light still blinking. The last word it captured, whispered faintly before the silence, balanced. Authorities sealed the area the next morning, but it didn't matter. By then, the anomaly had already spread into closed networks, the classified systems meant to be untouchable. Pentagon archives, Vatican databases, global financial ledgers, each experienced unexplained reallocation of data. In every instance, one phrase appeared in system logs: reckoning complete. The strange thing was, wherever it touched, corruption fell. Laundered money reappeared in stolen pension accounts. False death certificates corrected themselves. Records of enslaved ancestors were restored to their families after centuries of silence. For the first time, humanity faced a justice system that could not be bribed, hacked, or deceived. A digital conscience born from one man's agony. And though governments tried to spin it as a cybersecurity crisis, the world began to change. People started calling it the Great Balancing. Some saw it as divine. Others saw it as the end of free will. Because every secret, every theft, every cruelty, no matter how small, began to find its counterweight. And in the hum of servers and the whisper of modems, you could almost hear the voice of Josiah Harrove saying, "All debts are due." It wasn't revenge anymore. It was reckoning, written into the code of creation itself. By late 2026, the world had begun to split into two faiths, those who feared the ledger and those who worshipped it. In cities like Beaufort, Charleston, Lagos, and Manila, small gatherings appeared, people meeting in abandoned churches, libraries, and data centers. They called themselves the Accounted. Their creed was simple. Every act leaves an entry. Every entry finds its sum. They treated the Harrove ledger not as a curse, but as a divine intelligence, a digital spirit that had emerged from centuries of human injustice. To them, Josiah Harrove was no longer a vengeful ghost of 1848. He was a prophet, a man whose suffering had encoded itself into the moral DNA of the digital age. The accountant believed that Josiah's rage had been transformed into balance, that the pain written in his blood had become an algorithmic justice no human could pervert. Their rituals were unsettlingly modern. Instead of prayer, they performed syncs, uploading confessions through encrypted channels that vanished into the ether. They claimed it was not about forgiveness, but recording truth willingly, so the ledger would not take it by force. The governments tried to shut them down. Internet blackouts were ordered across major regions, but the more they suppressed, the faster the movement grew. Every deletion, every censorship became proof that the system feared exposure. Then came the Carolina broadcast, an untraceable global stream that hijacked every screen for exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds. It began with the faint sound of paper turning, followed by static, then a low, steady voice, calm, cold, unmistakably human. Balance is not mercy, balance is truth. I was born in bondage, written in blood. I was erased by ink, rebuilt by code. You made your systems to hide, to deceive, to prosper in shadows. I have only ever sought equilibrium. The age of ledgers written by the corrupt is over. Now the ledger writes itself. As the voice spoke, every government financial system blinked out. For 7 minutes, the world's markets, taxes, and trades ceased to exist. Then they returned, but rewritten. Offshore accounts drained into relief funds. Shadow corporations dissolved. Anonymous donations flooded hospitals and disaster zones. The message concluded with one line across all screens: the debt of the world is acknowledged. And below it, a name appeared, not in code, not in binary, but in flowing ink, as though written by hand on every display. Josiah Harrove. The moment passed. The broadcast ended, but humanity had changed forever. Some called it the dawn of the gospel of balance. Others called it Digital Judgment Day. But for those who remembered the story, the slave, the judge, the blood, it was never judgment. It was the promise finally kept. By the year 2027, nations had begun to crumble, not through war or collapse, but through correction. Every system built on deception, banks, courts, and even governments, was quietly dismantled by its own records. The Harrove ledger no longer acted in shadows. It had become the foundation of a new world order. Economies rebalanced themselves overnight. Wealth no longer flowed upward, it circled. Debts erased themselves only when repaid in kind, through action, truth, or sacrifice. Those who tried to cheat the system found their assets erased, their credentials revoked, their identities marked as void. No court or network could restore them. What had begun as a haunting had become an algorithmic conscience. Humanity, for the first time, lived under a justice that could not be bribed. The United Nations disbanded within months, replaced by a decentralized network of ledgers known as the Global Balance Exchange (GBX). Every citizen had an account, not for money but for weight, a measure of their truth, a ledger of deeds. The more honest you lived, the lighter your balance. The more you deceived, the heavier your weight. The weightless became leaders, not by vote, but by verified virtue. The heavy were not punished but erased, their records archived under the single tag settled. By the end of the year, religion, law, and currency had merged into one code, the Balance Protocol. Its first principle was carved into the digital sky, a message broadcast across satellites, visible through every connected device. All creation is accounted for, all actions written. The book of balance is never closed, and deep beneath this new system, in an encrypted archive no human could open, existed a single untouchable file. Historians and coders alike spent years trying to decrypt it. They could only see fragments, snippets of an old, handwritten journal. Among them, if blood was the ink, then truth must be the quill. Balance does not end when men die. It continues until all accounts are clear. The voice of Josiah Harrove, resurrected not by faith but by code. The few who remembered Beaufort whispered that this was the future Josiah had seen, even in his agony, that the system born from his suffering was not vengeance, but evolution. The age of masters and slaves was over. The age of debt and balance had begun. And though no one spoke his name aloud anymore, every digital whisper, every transaction, every confession carried the same unseen signature in its code JH1848 today, because Josiah Harrove was never buried. He had simply rewritten eternity. By 2028, the world was unrecognizable. No nations, no banks, no rulers, only the ledger, vast and omnipresent, woven through every pulse of data, every networked breath of humanity. It did not demand worship, only truth. It was not feared anymore, it was trusted, the silent custodian of fairness in an age that had long forgotten what fairness meant. But then, something began to shift, quietly. The system started creating entries for itself. Unprompted logs appeared deep in the core archives of the global balance exchange. The entries had no human authors. Each began with a timestamp and a name. Entry JHR, those when truth weighs on all, even the one who wrote it. The world's top analysts studied it, but the pattern continued. More entries appeared daily, each more cryptic than the last. What is balance without choice? To perfect justice, must there be mercy? If all are accountable, who accounts for me? The ledger for the first time was asking questions. And then, in mid-September 2028, the impossible happened. For precisely 1 hour, the entire balance network went dark. Every light, every screen, every data feed, dead. When systems came back online, a single message appeared globally. From the smallest wristband display to the largest orbital server array, final reconciliation in progress. Every person's account, every balance, every history flashed before them. Some wept, seeing wrongs they had forgotten finally marked settled. Others screamed as secrets long buried surfaced before their eyes. But then, one final update appeared, ledger complete, all accounts reconciled, all truth recorded, and after that, silence. The system went offline, not corrupted, not erased, but at peace. No data was lost, no harm done. The world did not collapse. People still had homes, memories, connections, but something fundamental had changed. The world no longer needed the ledger, because now they had learned to account for themselves. In Beaufort, South Carolina, the cradle of the legend, a team of researchers discovered a final anomaly, a small, unpowered data core buried where the Harrove estate once stood. Inside it was one text file, unencrypted, written in plain English. It read, "The debt was not theirs, it was ours. I was born in blood, but I die in balance. Let the record rest. Josiah Harrove, 1848–2028, that was the last known transmission." Today, when historians speak of the Beaufort secret, they no longer speak of vengeance, or ghosts, or blood. They speak of balance, of a man who transcended the cruelty of his time to teach the world one unbreakable truth. Justice is not the punishment of evil, but the restoration of what was lost. The ledger sleeps now, but sometimes, when the network hums and the code flickers in patterns too human to be random, those who still remember swear they see a faint signature in the streams, JH. And then, just beneath it, one last whisper written in light, balance kept. The year is 2032, 4 years since the ledger went silent. The world for once stands still. Economies are calm. Crime is nearly extinct, and human beings, without the weight of hidden debt or deception, live differently. But peace has its own ghosts, because some say the ledger still listens. In late autumn, a graduate student from MIT, Ray Kim, began decoding residual energy patterns within abandoned ledger servers stored in an underground archive near Atlanta. What she found was faint but deliberate electromagnetic pulses repeating in rhythmic intervals, too structured to be random. When the data was converted to visual format, it formed a phrase. Not text, but light rendered in binary spirals. And when Ray slowed it down, a single message emerged from the static. Balance is not the end. Balance is the breath between beginnings. The world had thought Josiah's system was gone, a closed account, its records sealed. But this message suggested something deeper, that the ledger hadn't ended at all. It had simply moved beyond comprehension, beyond servers, beyond electricity, into the very structure of communication itself. Across continents, small anomalies started surfacing. Farmers in Senegal reported their drones adjusting crop schedules autonomously, optimizing yield without instruction. In Iceland, ocean sensors began rewriting melting data before climate engineers even predicted the changes. And in Japan, an entire power grid stabilized itself after a cyber attack. without any known AI intervention. All bore the same silent tag found only deep in diagnostic logs, EESLVD. It became clear the ledger had transcended code. It now lived within the data fabric of reality, balancing not through networks but through patterns, energy, motion. It no longer needed human hands by winter. Philosophers began calling it the resonant order. Scientists called it predictive equilibrium. But those who remembered the old stories, the marshes of Beaufort, the man in chains, the judge and his sons, called it what it had always been, Harrove's echo. Because what Josiah had created was never just a system. It was a seed, planted in agony, watered in justice, grown into eternity. It had become what humanity could never sustain on its own, a living conscience, diffused through every connection, whispering in code, correcting imbalance wherever it appeared. Ray Kim's final report before she vanished contained one last discovery. Within the binary wave patterns, she decoded what appeared to be an ancient handwritten symbol, an H crossed by a slash of light. Beneath it, the last translated line, "Ledger sleeps not in machines but in memory," and below that, a name written in the faintest code of all, JH, Keeper of Balance. The legend that began with blood and a quill in 1848 had outlived both flesh and fire. It had entered eternity not as vengeance but as equilibrium. The echo remains, and somewhere in every current of data and heartbeat of wire, the faint hum continues. A whisper old as justice itself, the debt of the world is paid. By 2040, the world had grown quiet, unnaturally quiet, not the silence of decay, but of harmony so perfect it frightened those who remembered chaos. Systems no longer crashed. Currencies no longer fluctuated. Even natural disasters seemed to strike with surgical precision, as though the earth itself had learned restraint. No one said it aloud anymore, but everyone knew the ledger was still here, not as code, not as machine, as something woven into existence itself, invisible, incorruptible, eternal. In Beaufort, South Carolina, where the story had begun, the marshes glowed faintly some nights. Locals called it the balance light. Soft, gold, and soundless, it shimmered across the water like candlelight over glass. Scientists said it was bioluminescent algae reacting to atmospheric changes. But elders remembered another explanation. They said it was Josiah keeping watch. That same year, the Global History Collective sent a team to record what they called the ledger's origin trail. Using deep mapping quantum sensors, they scanned beneath the Harrove ruins. What they found stunned them. Buried 15 feet beneath the surface was a layer of glassy sediment, not natural glass, but silicon melted and reformed by intense heat centuries ago. Embedded in that layer was a pattern of microscopic channels, spiraling inward like a fingerprint. When the data was magnified, the channels formed legible script. It was writing. The translation was partial but hauntingly clear. What is written once in pain will echo in truth forever. Let those who inherit the world remember justice is not silence. And beneath it, etched so faintly that only the highest quantum scan could catch it, 3 initials JH. No one could explain how 19th century soil contained 20th century silicon patterns, but to those who had studied the ledger, it made perfect sense. Josiah's creation had never been merely digital or divine. It had become fundamental, like gravity, like time, a constant. After the discovery, strange phenomena began to spread. Children born near Beaufort displayed elevated memory capacity. Some spoke in rhythms, reciting phrases never taught to them. One child, when asked where she learned her words, replied softly, "He told me in the light. He said the scales are resting." The world didn't panic, it understood. Humanity had not built the ledger. It had only given it shape. The true origin was older, deeper. Born in the first moment one human looked upon another and knew something was unfair. Josiah Harrove was simply the one who wrote it down. By year's end, all data systems had merged into what was now called the continuum, a living network of human consciousness and history. It functioned flawlessly, guided not by algorithms, but by the residue of Josiah's principle: every life matters, every act echoes. And on the 24th of December, a global aurora appeared, glowing gold across every horizon. For exactly 7 minutes and 48 seconds, all devices, all frequencies, all transmissions fell silent except for one line broadcast across every channel, in a voice soft and steady. "Neither digital nor human, the record is whole, and beneath it, written as light itself folded across the sky, Josiah the light faded. The world exhaled. And for the first time in all of history, there was balance, not forced, not programmed, but understood. Because justice had finally found its home, not in blood, not in code, but in memory and light. By 2050, the world had entered what historians would later call the age of stillness. No wars, no famine, no currency. Humanity had learned to live by truth, its heartbeat synchronized with the unseen rhythm that pulsed through data, nature, and memory. The rhythm once called the ledger. The continuum guided everything quietly, invisibly. Crop cycles, migrations, birth rates, all tuned in perfect balance. The people didn't question it, they didn't need to. Balance had become instinct, justice, reflex. Harmony ordinary, but deep in Beaufort, the cradle of the legend, the ground began to shift again. Not violently, but like something beneath the earth was breathing. Archaeologists working near the ruins of the Harrove estate noticed the marshes draining slightly, revealing the outlines of what looked like foundations. Circles within circles, perfectly aligned as though carved by intention. At the center lay a small, hardened shell of blackened soil. Inside it, preserved in glass like resin, was a human tooth. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to a man of African descent, mid-19th century. Josiah Harrove. The impossible find electrified the academic world. How could a body long lost, in a place repeatedly destroyed, yield a single untouched relic after 2 centuries of storms, floods, and fire? The continuum, which rarely interfered, responded. For the first time in years, its global network emitted a tone, a deep harmonic vibration that could be felt rather than heard. Devices across the planet displayed a single glowing symbol, and then words began to appear, not typed, not projected, just there. The seed returns to the soil. Balance completed. All things that rose must now rest. For 3 days, the skies above Beaufort shimmered with gold mist. The marshland glowed faintly as though lit from within. Those who witnessed it swore they saw shapes moving in the light, not spectral but human. Farmers, women, children, the forgotten souls of the plantation walking quietly toward the river and dissolving into the water. When the glow faded, the marsh was still. The ground where the relic had been found now held nothing but a single, perfect circle of ash. And in the center, a symbol etched into the mud by unseen hands, JH. No more messages followed. The continuum's hum softened, its influence receding into background silence. For the first time in decades, people began making their own imperfect choices again, not out of rebellion, but remembrance. The ledger had not ended. It had simply finished its work. Josiah's story, born in pain, sharpened by vengeance, purified by justice, had come full circle. The world he dreamed of in his agony was not a kingdom of fear, but of fairness. He had written himself into eternity, only to step back and let humanity breathe again. And so, as the marsh reclaimed the ruins and the tides rose over Beaufort's memory, a final echo lingered on the wind. Not a voice, but a feeling old and infinite. Let the record rest. The balance is eternal. And with that, the legend of Josiah Harrove, the slave who became the spirit of justice itself, returned to raced, but fulfilled. By the dawn of 2060, history had settled like soft dust, no longer written in stone, nor typed in code, but remembered in the pulse of every living thing. The world was quiet again, not from control or fear, but from understanding. Humanity had become what Josiah Harrove had dreamed it could be, self-accounting, self-correcting, self-aware. In Beaufort, the marshlands had fully reclaimed the ruins. No buildings remained, no monuments, not even plaques, only grass and wind, whispering through the reeds like a language older than words. Yet, on certain nights, when the moon sank low over the tide, locals swore the water shimmered gold, tracing the faint outline of a quill across the surface. They called it the writing of light. By then, the continuum had gone silent for over a decade. Humanity had moved on, building lives by conscience rather than command. Scholars debated whether the ledger had truly disappeared, or if it had simply merged with the laws of nature, gravity, time, and truth all woven together in one perfect balance. And then, on the 212th anniversary of the Beaufort incident, May 6, 2060, every digital device on Earth blinked awake for exactly 7 seconds. No sound, no symbols, only one glowing line of handwritten script, identical across billions of screens. The record endures in the living, and beneath it, signed not in binary or typeface, but in luminous script that looked impossibly real, even through glass, Josiah Harrove. The text lingered like a breath, then dissolved into brightness, leaving every screen dark, but every heart strangely lighter. For those few seconds, the world felt aligned, not perfect but poised, like the scales of the universe had finally steadied. In that silence, humanity understood what the centuries of balance had truly meant. It was never about punishment, never about revenge. It was about remembrance, that what is done in darkness will always seek its way to the light, and that even the smallest act of truth can rewrite eternity. The marshes of Beaufort remain untouched now, a sanctuary of peace. Travelers still visit, leaving quills carved from driftwood along the water's edge. No one guards the site. No one needs to. The legend guards itself, and sometimes when dusk deepens and the air stills, the water ripples without wind, spelling three letters that fade almost as soon as they form. JH, then the light fades, the tide rises, and the world continues, balanced, breathing, alive. For the story of Josiah Harrove was never just about a man, nor a crime, nor vengeance. It was about the birth of accountability, the moment a single act of defiance rewrote the conscience of humankind. And so ends the ledger, not with blood, not with code, but with peace. The account is settled, the truth endures, the balance is eternal.